Hello, everyone. Hi, my name is Alan Herrera. I oversee editorial operations for the wonderful Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States, that is AFPC-USA. And I have the pleasure of hosting. This is actually the very first time I've moderated one of our webinar programs, so this is very cool for me. Today we have practical tools for climate action, and it is part of AFPC USA's partnership with the great team at ASU, Arizona State University, and the Julia N. Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. We are, of course, grateful to everybody there, especially the excellent Ambassador Amanda Ellis. So thank you, Amanda. Um, so this educational program, we are going to explore practical tools that are designed to empower governments, journalists, youth, and individuals to drive climate action and accountability. As part of this panel session, I hope that whoever is listening to us today will take much away from it, especially any journalists who are on and listening to us today, because this is ultimately about bridging the gap between journalism and climate education. So anyway, enough about that. I would like to introduce our two wonderful panelists today. We have our two speakers. We have Patricia Solis and we have Gavin McCormick. So, welcome both for all of you here. Patricia is the Executive Director of the Knowledge Exchange for Resilience and Associate Research Professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at ASU. She is also the co-founder and director of Youth Mappers, which is a fascinating initiative of student-led humanitarian mapping chapters in more than 400 university campuses in 80 countries. Her disciplinary expertise centers on the application of participatory geospatial technologies for environment and developmental projects, especially related to extreme heat. She is wonderful. And we have Gavin, as I said, and he is the executive director of What Time. And What Time is a nonprofit that first developed automated emissions reduction technology, or AER. Today, it is used by 900 million devices worldwide every day. He also co-founded and co-leads Climate Trace, which we'll dive into that. And Climate Trace is a coalition of over 150 collaborating nonprofits, universities, and tech companies, and they all pool their expertise in artificial intelligence, satellites, and emissions to jointly monitor global emissions. So I know that we'll hear more about that over the course of our conversation, but thank you to both of you, Patricia and Gavin, for being here with me today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
So I would like to start. We can dive into Climate Trace. Gavin, Climate Trace has revolutionized emissions tracking by pinpointing sources down to the facility level. Could you tell us what are just some of the most surprising or impactful discoveries that you've made using this data, particularly in countries where official reporting might have gaps or delays? It would just be great to hear about how this all works.
Sure. Maybe first in terms of how it works, the short version is Climate Trace is a little bit like Wikipedia for emissions. So the idea is we have all these different organizations contributing to the same data set. But one slight difference from Wikipedia is that we really want to make sure that no emissions get counted twice and no emissions are missing. So we've worked really hard as a coalition to make sure that for everything in the world that causes climate change, at least one NGO or university is looking at measuring its emissions. And that's put in a big database. So when you add up the total, it matches all the emissions that are going to the atmosphere every day. And so the idea is you can go to this kind of like one-stop shop from many, many different institutions and get a picture of what's going on. And just a couple examples of some surprises we found. One is one of our original mandates actually was from the United Nations to dig into countries that might be lying under the Paris Agreement. The whole idea is countries report their own emissions. I think the actually really happy surprise is that we did not find the evidence of lying that we were expecting to find. So actually, interesting twist, it looks like countries participating in the Paris Agreement were being much more honest with each other than all the negotiators believed, which has interesting positive implications for the negotiations, where they're all trying to decide if they trust each other. Another example was digging into whether companies are falsifying data for their governments. And there we have found a general pattern that a lot of companies, their emissions data from space pretty much seems to check out with what they're reporting. But there's one big global outlier, and that is the oil and gas industry. Not all fossil fuels, just the oil and gas industry. We've seen really systematic, widespread evidence around the world that many oil and gas companies are indeed providing incorrect emissions data. And if you look at, for example, coal companies, which you might have guessed were the same, we don't see that evidence. So that's a pretty interesting surprise. And then maybe just one last surprise, I would say, is that emissions from landfills turn out to be a much bigger deal than anyone knew. And the reason for that seems to be that there's a lot of landfills around the world that are causing a lot of emissions that nobody owns. So nobody kind of knew about them or was paying attention to them. So they were just going missed in most inventories because that's not my landfill for anybody. And so more emissions from oil and gas due to some pretty sketchy reporting, more emissions from landfills because just everybody forgot about them. And most other emissions data looks a lot more reliable than people thought. Those are some of our big discoveries.
That is, it's very interesting because I would love to hear more just about how this data is collected and verified with so many partners, considering that it's such a huge initiative. We have, Amanda here, actually, who is raising her hand. Let us see. Hello, Amanda.
Thank you. Hi there. Thank you so much, Gavin. Fascinating to hear about oil and gas. My question is, what do you do next? Do you report that to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change? Or do you go directly to the companies and say, hey, our satellite data looks very different from your reporting? What's the next step?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Climate Trace is a group that is really bending over backwards to provide a just the facts solution. And so, we're not Greenpeace. We're not out there going and naming. You maybe noticed I didn't mention which oil companies we see issues with. We are not in the business of kind of trying to be the climate police, but we are trying to be just a neutral data set that provides the facts for anyone who is interested in that role. So yes, we are in discussions with some key UN agencies just to make sure they get independent checks on what countries are reporting. We don't see what happens after we make sure that relevant folks have the data they need. That's sort of their business, what they want to do about that. But our experience also in the corporate sector is there's a lot more groups than you might think who do want the right data, not just so we can shout about it, because they can take concrete actions. So just like one little example, a lot of companies that buy large amounts of some good, let's say steel, are using Climate Trace to say, okay, can you report for us which facilities are causing how much emissions per ton of steel? And we, the buyers, care a lot about just true, honest, independent reporting. And we are going to shift our buying to the companies that are doing a good job reducing steel emissions. So companies like GM, Tesla, Boeing are using our data for things like that. And so our theory is that we just provide data. We're not in the business of having the next step. But we do make sure that everybody who is interested in taking next steps has exactly what they need to do whatever their climate goals are.
Great, thank you.
Thank you,
Gavin-
Amanda, for participation.
Gavin, I have a question for you as well.
Sure,
I'm a
yeah.
I'm a geographer, so I'm interested in understanding what is the spatial resolution of your data. You're saying that
Yeah.
it's point resolution, facility level resolution, and is that available at that scale?
Excellent question.
It's such a good question, and you'll maybe tell I'm not a geographer by we had to come up with some words of our own, and maybe you'll tell me there are better words for this. We decided to focus on what we call the asset level, where an asset is whatever is the most detailed information we can think of, and we use that word because often it's like a power plant, an airport, something that somebody owns.
Yeah.
But what do you do in a forest? Is an asset a tree? Is an asset like a tract of land? And so
Sure.
Climate Trace is a funny mix of point source assets and just like we drew some lines on a map, often at 10-meter resolution, often at 500-meter resolution, like here's what's going on right here.
Right. Pretty close. We call them point lines and polygons.
Okay,
So
yeah,
you're
so we're
very
a mix of
close.
them. Yeah. Yeah, lines are interesting, like a ship that's moving. I guess that's a line.
Or a road.
Yep,
Absolutely. Fantastic.
interesting.
It's very interesting just hearing this this thought process. One of my favorite things as a journalist, as just a member of the press, is that I get the opportunity to just hear experts, just talk. And for me, it's like being in class all the time, which is fun. If you like academia, you thrive in the field, which I do. And my question is, I would just love to know, how does all this information, I just want to gain a better understanding of this. How does this information gathered by Climate Trace drive more effective mitigation strategies? I feel like you've delved into that a bit more,
Yeah.
but I would love, like more practical examples of like how you've seen this manifested.
Yeah, so I think, the original concept of climate trace is one answer, and then we're doing some new things as well. So the original concept, it drew its analog to, Al Gore likes to talk about a revolution that happened called CompStat in policing, actually, where it used to be the case that a lot of police officers and various folks involved in law enforcement would have to guess what crimes were going on. And when the field got organized to say, okay, here is a database, everybody can see what crimes were committed in what area. The example he uses is there are suddenly meetings where a police chief and the school superintendent and a beat cop might be in the same room saying, what are we going to do about this area and this crime? And it sort of solved this like creative problem solving dynamic. And so that is going on. But one thing about that dynamic is we often never hear, right? So we don't get the feedback on how many people around the world had a next step after they sat down and had meetings like that on Climate Trace. So that action is going on. And we know there are cities, companies, governments, researchers using the data. But that type of theory of change, we never get the feedback on what happens next. And a different type that we are now spending more and more time on is where the data have right there in there, what is a specific action that would reduce emissions if you take it? So the first example we did was if companies buy from this facility, not that facility, you can actually use our data to calculate exactly how that would drive emissions down. Another famous example is, hey, we can tell you that this facility has a lot of emissions because it's leaking methane, which is horrible for the environment. Great, so there's a really clear action, plug that leak. And then a third example is facility retrofitting. So for example, we've been able to pinpoint all these landfills no one knew about. It is often one of the fastest, cheapest ways to fight climate change is just cover a landfill. There's a few details, but basically put some dirt on top of that thing and you cut its emissions by about 80%. And we can argue about slightly fancier methods, could you cut it 85%, 90%? And so we're supporting a lot of governments around the world who are trying to point capital at emissions reducing projects, supplying them with data like the following. If you were to cap the 100 most famous landfills everyone already knows about, here would be the emissions reductions. If you were to use Climate Trace to identify the 100 landfills that maybe you didn't know they existed, but actually those things are the biggest problem for emissions and you can make the biggest difference by capping them, we're in conversations with folks like the World Bank who are saying, wait a minute, that means the same capital I was going to allocate to reduce emissions in landfills can actually multiply how much emissions it reduces just with better data. And we're starting to be in a lot of conversations with companies and governments like that, who they already know how much money they want to spend to reduce emissions. And we're helping them target it to projects that would be more impactful with the same capital.
That is fascinating to hear about because particularly your point about landfills, I had never heard such a statistic in my life. So I feel like this is a perfect example, right, of what we've been discussing, right? Like climate trace in action essentially allows us to envision a future where these solutions are right in front of us. They're right in front of us. We can see them. They're tangible. They're actionable. Thank you so much for that. We have another question from Amanda, who I always love to hear from. So let's see. Yes. Amanda, you're on.
Thank you so much for allowing me to give another example. So Gavin, my hometown of Dunedin in New Zealand, in using Climate Trace, discovered that the biggest source of emissions was the landfill. And so now the city council, just a few months ago, has distributed compost bins for food scraps for all of the households. So I think that's a really practical example on a tiny scale of how being able to use a tool like Climate Trace shows then what is the most impactful local action that can be taken. So I wanted to say a big thank you for that, and also say that I'd love at some stage for you to show us a couple of slides, because parliamentarians and journalists who are going to be watching this, I think, will be so interested to see just how easy it is to use Climate Trace, noting that they need to do it on a computer, not on a mobile phone, but it just gives such a useful tool for them and also for civil society to be able to hold governments to account.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. That's such a good example. I had no idea that happened in Dunedin, and I actually used to live near Dunedin, and so pretty fascinating example of put the right data out in the world, and you don't always know how it's going to drive impact. But yeah, I'd be happy to show an example. Is that a good moment to maybe screen share a little bit?
Yes.
Yes.
Then let's see. Maybe what I can start by doing is just showing the site itself. So if you look here at this world map, so this is all of the emissions caused by human activity in the world. It doesn't tell you volcanoes and things like that. And the different colors are different sectors of the economy. So for example, orange is the oil and gas facilities, blue is manufacturing, green is waste, and so on. And what you can do is you can zoom into any particular area. So for example, I'm in Philadelphia, and so you can look around for the emissions of, say, Philadelphia, and you can both zoom in very closely to the individual asset level. So for example, here is the airport is one of the largest sources of emissions in Philadelphia. And you can see we have data on how the emissions have changed over time. You can see we have health emissions, so carbon monoxide and so on. You can see our uncertainty and confidence in the data accuracy. That's important to a lot of scientists. And you can see metadata like who owns this facility. And you can do that for all types of different assets. So for example, the water sanitation department. But then what you can also do is you can do things like click on a city or country and get more details about the information. So, oh, that's the global version. So I click on Philadelphia here and I click on more details. What this tells you is a breakdown of all the emissions for this city, and you can do this for any city, state, or country in the world. And these are all estimates, of course, but they're pretty detailed estimates. So we see, for example, the largest source of emissions in Philadelphia is the road transport. You can see buildings is number 2. An individual power plant, Edgemoor, is actually the number 4 largest source. And you can scroll through the list of emissions data and get information on what is driving emissions in your region. And a big new feature we're going to be releasing later this year is for each of those sources of emissions, what is at least one thing you could do to reduce those emissions? So as we are starting to get better and better data on where are those emissions coming from, we're going to be able to share science-backed solutions on how you can take action on each of those facilities. So that's just maybe a quick lightning view of how a person could go to climatetrace.org and access free data for any city, any country, any state, any county, and get what are the emissions, what's their breakdown, what are the facilities, how they change over time, and coming soon, what are some tips and ideas on ways you could reduce those emissions, including which ones might be a little easier to reduce emissions and which ones might be a little harder.
Thank you so much for this just a very informative presentation. I feel like there's so much doomerism, right? There's so much doomerism around climate change. I mean, I myself, I am not immune to it. I don't think any of us here in this little virtual room, right? Like we all get it. We're on the same page here. So one of the things that has helped me immensely, right, is knowing that there are wonderful tools, right? This is, of course, a new one for me, right? But these wonderful tools that gives us access to the information that we need to not only make the sorts of choices to, well, hold, for example, government figures into account, but so also we can make our own personal choices. So we can make choices that eventually, hopefully, lend themselves to good governance. And knowing that there's a whole brand of solutions journalism and people out there who really are living up to its ideals is, important to fighting, in my experience, from what I have seen. And perhaps, Patricia, you might, like to weigh in here as well. I think that it's important to counter stuff like just high rates of misinformation and disinformation, combating climate denial. It's, of course, an uphill battle, but when I see stuff like this, it makes me feel like it makes it so much easier for in this case, right, journalists and media professionals, it gives us the opportunity to really share important information that will make people feel like they can actually take definitive action. So thank you for that. That's fascinating. Patricia, do you have any comments? I mean, you are also on a lovely learning journey with me, so it's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really great. I also just wonder, projects like this, because I know very well, I'm going to talk about another project that I managed called Youth Mappers as well. They take so many resources and so many people that I know it's usually a team effort on this. How do you keep something like this that is probably resource intensive?
Oh
How do you
yeah.
manage this and keep it
Mhm.
going? And I know I'm sure it's a massive effort for you, and wanted to hear what you thought about that. Like,
No
how do you
Yeah.
doubt.
keep these things going?
I think there's sort of two, I mean, it's just so true, right? There's so many resources. And I think one part is how do you get enough resources, and the other is how do you just coordinate 150 different organizations? How many people is that actually? So in terms of the resources, we're a philanthropically supported group. It's all nonprofit, everything is free. We're fortunate that Al Gore does much of the fundraising and just really believes in climate trace. He has been clear and consistent since the 90s. He thinks the key to beating climate change is honest, good data that leaves polluters nowhere to hide and just means that everybody who's actually trying to solve the problem can be in the same team here. And so he is currently fundraising for the next round of climate trace from a lot of foundations. But that's just how do you get the resources. I think the other half of what I kind of hear in your comment is how do you coordinate with that many groups? And so I think one of the big breakthroughs on climate trace is we're actually the 20th project that tried to measure emissions from space using satellites. But we're the first one that has gotten so far. And I think it's because we just tripped over a different organizational design. So every other project had the idea, they figured out that AI and data always works better when you combine it. But every other project had a CEO and it was one organization that is in charge or one professor that is in charge and everybody else gives them data. Well, it's like, well, why would you say yes to that? And so you might have noticed I have no title on Climate Trace. There is no CEO of Climate Trace. Nobody is in charge. The logic is all of these organizations work out what deal would work out for everybody who's trying to beat climate. And we prioritize recruiting organizations that are known to be good collaborators and are interested in saying, I will share this data if you share that data. And this network negotiation strategy instead of one boss strategy, it's been the key to why we can all actually work together. And sometimes it's slow and messy, but it just has that stability that something like Wikipedia has that one nonprofit doesn't have.
Something that comes to mind here for me, Gavin. Oh, and forgive me, Patricia, if you wanted to say something.
Go ahead.
Do forgive me. I didn't mean to cut you
No, no,
off.
no, go.
What comes to mind is particularly when you mentioned Al Gore, right? Who, of course, he's been at the forefront of this, for many, many years. Your point about him and data, right? Governments often rely on emissions data, but this emissions data is often self-disclosed. So that can be outdated or that can be incomplete. So then how does Climate Trace's independent tracking system, right? How does that compare to official reports? And what challenges or opportunities can you tell us about? Like, what does this present for policymakers and for climate advocates in our era of increased environmental justice?
I think that it's been an education for me in that I started with a hypothesis, like a lot of us did, that the problem with bad data was emitters hiding or lying and falsifying. And I think this has been an education. No, the problem is this is really hard. And so the vast majority of governments we see, they're using crude estimates. There's a lot of cases where the data are, in some cases, there are national inventories that are 20 years out of date. I mean, it's ridiculous. It doesn't tell you anything. A more common pattern would be something like 4 years out of date. The global community is attempting to move what is technically 2-year-old data. It's really actually in most cases 3 years old at the national level based on estimates. And what we are attempting to do is say, let's find anybody in the world who has something more detailed. In most cases, somebody in the world has monthly data and for some problem. And let's put it in one database so that instead of saying who is the decider, it's like anybody can access whatever the best data anybody has come up with. And what we've really done is created a system where that can all go in one place. And any one user doesn't have to contact 150 organizations to get the latest data. at any given moment. And so we are moving as of March 2025, which is a few weeks from now, to monthly updates for every source of emissions in the world. But it'll be the huge grab bag of different organizations that are actually making that possible. But any one user can access what happened in emissions in any country, in any sector last month.
This is I continue to marvel at it. Just it's clear to me that this is it's just a highly intricate system. It's highly intricate, highly thought out. I mean, please pat yourself, on the back a bit over it.
Big
But
team.
yeah. There's definitely something, there's definitely another question I have for you, but I feel that it's something that you can both answer, jointly, just about how these tools, just the wider benefits overall. But I would like to just pivot to Patricia for a moment. And Patricia, we would love to know more about youth mappers. I think what's coming to mind after listening to Gavin's presentation, right, is that he's giving us you're both in the business of data, right? The science of data, if you will. And the thing about that is that it allows us to look at these very often, for many people, right, these very scary, traumatic, like extreme weather events and, caused by, increased fossil fuel emissions. We see this happening, but for many people it can be, of course, it's very scary, it's very demoralizing. And here we have something like what you're doing, which is this wider, just like this youth effort. We're talking about getting younger people involved to tackle the greatest existential threat of our time. So with that said, we have climate change intensifying extreme weather events. There's floods, hurricanes, extreme heat, etc. So how can participatory geospatial mapping, especially through initiatives like yours, through youth mappers, how does that help communities better prepare for and respond to disasters like these?
I'm just listening to you, Gavin, and I feel like we're kindred spirits. I think we're kind of like on the flip side of the coin of this problem of climate change, working with similar technologies and with a similar mindset. You mentioned at the very start the Wikipedia, the wiki of maps, and that's what we call OpenStreetMap, is the wiki map. It's the people map, the people's maps of the world, right? Everyone's familiar with Google Maps, and we use OpenStreetMap to map the world. And one thing that we know about climate change, you're over here mapping emissions, not just the cause of local pollution, but really in aggregate, one of the things that is warming the planet, which is causing all of this chaos in our climate system, which is really creating more frequent hurricanes and flooding and extreme heat and all of these disasters that we're seeing more and more and more of around the world. And there are 1 billion people on planet Earth that don't appear in any of these official maps. In Google Maps, you think that Google Maps maps everything and everybody, but it really is not really ubiquitous. You think that that's the case. It's a little bit hard to grasp our hands around. And Google Maps belongs to Google, actually. OpenStreetMap belongs to everybody. And who makes OpenStreetMap but the people? So that's what we do. We help support the use of OpenStreetMap primarily to the humanitarian community, a humanitarian development community, and also ourselves. Youth Mappers is actually a mapping community that is a community of the communities that are part of this open mapping community of OpenStreetMap. I call it a community of communities because there are a lot of people that go to OpenStreetMap to make the maps for themselves, but Youth Mappers is one of these. That is the student group community. In fact, OpenStreetMap was created by a student. Steve Coase was a physics student when he first kind of sparked that whole situation in 2004. And so, we kind of came together about 10 years ago to really work. I was prompted by my good friend at USAID, Carrie Stokes, to think about what would it look like if we gathered all of our students that we were working with and really put together a program. And so we kind of co-created this and did not know that it would really spark what became a movement, actually, not much of a program to speak of, and really grew beyond the initial sponsorship and funding that we've had, but had a lot of sponsors. And now it has grown to more than 425 universities have these student chapters in about 82 countries, where they are volunteers, self-organized, really, that we try to just throw as many resources that we can out into the network for leadership development, campaigns here and there. We do host some conferences and learning exercises, and as many kinds of support that we can do. And we also have validating teams. Just like you, Gavin, we want to make sure that that data is valid. And what we create is understanding of those vulnerabilities to these climate perils that we have. We have to know what is where. We have to know where are those roads that are getting flooded out. We have to know where are those communities that are getting hit by the hurricanes. We would often be caught into a campaign. Good example, when Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico several years ago, you may remember this, it was pretty massive. And the American Red Cross needed to understand where were all the buildings that were hit so that they could quickly respond and have a good understanding of how much funding to infuse onto the island. We had a Youth Mappers chapter at the University of Puerto Rico there, but they couldn't help map because they were actually dealing with no electricity and all sorts of things. And I was in Texas, and I said, no worries, we got your back. So there's students in Texas, or students in Bangladesh, or students in Kenya, or students in Uganda, or students in all over the world. Got online quickly, helped the humanitarian community map up all the building footprints. You can run an algorithm on that, turns out, to understand how much aid was needed to influx to really bring in enough resources for that response. Multiply that by any kind of disaster. You need to know what the features that are there and what is there, what are the attributes that are there. You can kind of see in this map behind me, this is the universe of places where youth mappers over the last 10 years have actually made their imprint. It turns out that these are the places that have affected the lives of about 62 million people. And we're pretty impressed with what you can do when you put the tools and invest in the capabilities of young people. What can they do? And give them a little bit of a spark, and let them run away with it and kind of get out of their way. And what can they make happen for being prepared in response into what are some of the disasters of climate, flooding, hurricanes, heat waves, extreme heat, all of those kinds of things that we're dealing with at this point.
This is it's very interesting to me. You used a specific word just now. You used invest, and I think that's the thing, right? We've spent so much time investing in fossil fuels, right, at the expense of the planet. We've been investing in, fossil fuels and all these other just terrible practices that are, the poisoning the air and the water that we drink and everything else. Why aren't we investing in our youth? The people, who they are living without, with our decisions right now and what's going, right now and after we're gone. And given that you've taken, such a heavy interest in all this, Patricia, can you just tell us, some other standout examples that come to mind of how these student-led mapping efforts have just made a tangible impact in disaster preparedness or response efforts? It's really cool, just knowing what you said just now about Hurricane Maria, and just the drive that's there, right, to help people and to demystify, these very frightening extreme weather events. I'd love to know.
Yeah, my favorite examples are when we kind of work across the borders to help each other. Obviously, there's lots and lots of local examples where students, they understand their own communities, and they can, come up with some very creative ways of using tools to reveal those invisible spaces. There's an example of really great group of universities in Sierra Leone where they, in fact, did not have, some of their own universities did not have electrification on their own campuses. And we're working with their Ministry of Environment and Development to map where some of their towns were electrified and where they were not electrified. They got on, you can use your phone to also take street view imagery. And we worked with Meta to actually devise a way to do this with, multiple students at one time, because it's actually, we're almost always working in groups, not just one individual at a time, collecting data, and to be able to massively process, scores and scores and dozens and thousands of imagery, and run it through their AI system to detect on whether, what was happening in those photographs, on whether the images going by contained utility poles, or whether that was actually a coconut tree, for example, instead of a utility pole, and process that and create a topography through the streets of their towns on where were the electric grids and where they were not. So that we could very quickly have a picture of the places and the towns that had electrical systems and not, so that the plans could be put into place on where the grid needed to be extended to the very universities where the students were located. And this is super inspiring that they can participate in their own development. And that is super important because 100% of heat-associated deaths are places that do not have air conditioning. And saving their own lives and bringing themselves, sustainable development. These were actually microgrids, solar grids that were in this plan for rural Sierra Leone. And this was done with 8 different Youth Mappers chapters. Really, really fantastic. That was work with the ASU LEAPS laboratory, the electrical laboratory for the grid definition. So amazing kinds of things. This is also workforce development. Imagine they got to understand how do these typologies get put together? How does AI work? We've had students, there was a really fantastic student from the Federal University of Nigeria. It put together his own Space Africa entrepreneurial company. He was named one of Forbes 30 under 30 in Africa. A group of women in Malawi started their own drone company. One of our students in Bangladesh was named as one of the youth representatives for the Gates Foundation GIS board. I mean, they are stellar talent that get to do these things and get discovered. And I'm just so proud to know them. So it's a workforce development, talent recognition, and we're very humbled to be able to be a part of their discovery process. And then they're solving problems. It's amazing.
I think that last part's extra interesting to me. So Climate Trace is mostly grown-ups, but my own nonprofit, What Time, we started as mostly students. I was a grad student myself when we started, so I've seen firsthand what I thought was a workforce development program, which is about training. There are situations where students actually end up beating the state of the art.
Oh, they're
and
moving
suddenly
faster than us. Let's just admit it.
Totally. So I would love it. Could you give any examples where actually what Youth Mappers has done is ahead of what you could get somewhere else? And what these students, particularly students from not necessarily very wealthy countries, they've actually managed by teamwork or good design to do something that other people can't do yet.
Well, I alluded to that.
Oh, forgive me. Sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought that Gavin just made an excellent point here, because what you're describing, right? He mentioned how they may come from countries that are less wealthy, right? So you have people who are making these strides despite having fewer resources at their disposal, because despite those challenges, they still are prepared to meet the challenges of this moment, because they've understood, right, that again, it gets back to my point earlier about these investments in fossil fuels, right? they also know that this stuff is being subsidized ultimately. It's not just about investment, it's about being subsidized. I know that Amanda would agree here. And that is to the tune of $7.1 trillion a year, which for any journalists, listening to us, that is a mind-boggling number. So to know that these initiatives exist, it's obviously worthwhile to know, and these tools will ultimately be helpful for everybody, whether we're talking about journalists, whether we're talking about policymakers, whether we're talking about parliamentarians or any other group, that might not be coming to mind right now. But forgive me, not to cut you off, Patricia. I'd love to hear more about what you were saying.
No, you're absolutely right. You're right to challenge them to look for that, because you'll find it. Well, I alluded to that with the gentleman from the Federal University of Technology in Akure in Nigeria, but also the one I was talking about in Sierra Leone. We were working with Mapillary, which is now owned by Meta. We helped them with the testing of making their AI tools into a group,
And that's new, right?
a tasking manager. They had their AI, they already had their AI tools, but we helped them transform into a group tool.
That's cool.
That's what we helped them transform it into that. And then also we were the first time we deployed for the first time a tool that's called MapSwipe, which was a German out of Heidelberg, a lab from Heidelberg, deployed that in the United States, because you think that this invisibility problem of the billion people, vulnerable people around the world, is only in the so-called developing world. But no, right here in our own state of Arizona, we have vulnerable people, the people who are very vulnerable to heat. They're also sometimes invisible to us. People who live in mobile and manufactured housing are extremely vulnerable to heat, and they are sometimes not really kind of hidden in plain sight. And we were trying to just put them on the map, and we discovered 10,000 people in the state of Arizona that were not, because they own their homes, but they don't own the lot. They're in these parks, and we didn't have a really good map. And we crowdsourced this using this MapSwipe tool, and we used youth mappers all over the world, thousands of them from all over these countries, to help us, fill in the gaps. So, there's some really innovative tools that are third-party private sector tools being used in super innovative ways in places that are ahead of the game, and kind of flipping the script. If you can kind of look in super interesting stories, if you wanted to write some really cool stories that will blow people's minds. I know, Gavin, you've got some of those as well. And
It's such good stuff.
I would think that would be really interesting on, we should do a mashup of what happens when you put these kinds of tools together, looking where are the emissions and where are the vulnerable people. What happens when you look at the overlap of those things together? What are we going to see when those are overlaid? What kind of things what would you notice when you put one thing next to the other?
Yeah, one interesting thing we've been paying more and more attention to is if you didn't have any other tools to measure emissions, the only thing you had was information about where there are people and how wealthy they are, you could actually figure out some surprisingly sophisticated information about emissions, because like a different way of looking at environmental justice is we systematically see it's just what you think. The emissions tend to cluster wherever there are large numbers of people who are not wealthy enough to demand more regulations. And that has interesting implications like, okay, wait, if you are going to retrofit one factory, going to a factory in Kenya is systematically more likely to mean that your investment will reduce more emissions than going to a factory in a really wealthy area. And there are these interesting, intricate patterns that wherever we find, it's usually not the very most vulnerable, it's the second most vulnerable communities. Those are where emissions are highest, and that's where the opportunities to mitigate them are the best, fastest, cheapest ways to reduce emissions. And so we spend a lot of time almost kind of flipping the script like you're talking about. And I bet there's even more interesting connections that I don't know about, but we're seeing a really tight link between wealth and emissions that's actually incredibly actionable to increase justice, but also just find better investments.
I think that that's a very valuable point, Gavin. I mean, your comment just now about just the connection between wealth and emissions, it got me thinking about how I'm in New York City, speaking to you from New York City, born and raised, and I grew up in a very, very, very poor, crime-ridden neighborhood, you know, through my early childhood. And I remember a statistic that I saw as a child was that the further you are from the subway station, right, the lower your life expectancy, the less money the less money you typically have. And it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
Yeah, higher rates of poverty that I personally witnessed. And I know for a fact that the neighborhood was dirtier, that it was cleaner. I knew that the corporations, they had a reputation for dumping waste, right, into chemical waste into the streams nearby and everything. We still have issues like that all over Brooklyn, for example, right? And these are the things that people don't really think about. There is this very unhealthy marriage here, between, the climate and, of course, right, our most vulnerable, our most marginalized populations. I think that I guess, right, with like all this in mind, right, and all these little data points, like how is it that uh thinking of data points, sorry, it's like what are some best practices, right, that both of you, I'd love to hear what you have to say. What would be some best practices for ensuring that all this data that's being collected, right, and shared through these platforms, how do we make sure that they remain accessible? How do we make sure that that they remain, that the data remains accurate? And how do we especially ensure that this data is and remains impactful for both policymakers and to the public? Because we want as many people to know, right, about these tools, and that is why the role of journalists here is so important, and why well, it's imperative that this be widely shared. So I'd love to hear what you both have to say. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll give a go at it first. And really, thank you so much for asking that question. And it's something that I think is super, super important. And Youth Mappers actually has an ethical statement, guidelines that we worked with our youth leaders to make sure and write, and that we promote through all of our chapters. And first and foremost is that we make sure that the data is collected with and by and for the people who live in the places where it's collected, and that and make sure that it's done with no harm. And that means that, for example, in collaboration with the humanitarian community in places where there is war and conflict, that is left to either the humanitarian community on the ground, if that's necessary, or not at all. There has to be a humanitarian purpose for collection of information. We always validate the data that's done with multiple people and multiple sites, like with the wiki principle, right? So that it's always open, always available, and subject to correction. And so those are things that are really super important, because, it's a very powerful thing to be able to place yourself on the map and to have the power to be seen, and to be seen in the way that you have the power of your visibility or not. So those are really, really important things to us. And so we take very, very much care of the map and care of each other. We also think it really matters who are creating the maps, and we have a whole program of work that's called Everywhere She Maps, because everywhere she maps, it is more powerful for her to be seen. And, for example, women occupy much different spaces than men in many parts of the world. There are parts of the world where mapping is illegal, and it's dangerous for our students to map. And so there are places in the world where Youth Mappers chapters do not exist because it is unsafe. So we take a lot of that very seriously. And so we have, you can go to our website and also see our ethical statement if you wanted to get in much more detail. So ethics is really, really important for us. And in any of our partners that we work with, we always, make sure that that's a big part of the conversation, quality as well. And all of that is a very dynamic part of our conversations and our actions and our activity.
Gavin, what do you have to say? We would
Yeah.
love to hear the climate trace perspective. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I would just agree with all those points. And I would say we're probably much less diverse on who makes the data, but we're improving on that point. And so we're recruiting generally not younger people, but universities in a lot of developing countries. And one of the things we've definitely seen is there's good talent anywhere. But one problem that really is different depending on who's doing it is, why are you gathering this data? And so, like, if our initial hypothesis is that the problem would be lying, and what we actually discovered is, like, the main problem in emissions data is, like, it's hard, so people just kind of look where the light is. If you're clear on why you are measuring emissions, you make very different choices when something is hard. So one example we've seen is there is such a bias in rich countries towards, we're just going to measure the emissions of rich countries because those data are easier to collect. And if what we're finding is that most of the impact and frankly the harm is from poor countries, that's not good enough. You can't just say, like, oh, we're just going to assume all those numbers are zero. Another thing we've seen is there's a really systematic bias on the part of very well-meaning climate scientists and carbon accountants to say, well, if I don't know, I'll just say nothing. And if you think about, if that is your home that's on fire and somebody said, well, it's hard to gather data in Malaysia, so I just ignore Malaysia, we think that's not good enough. And so we have this perspective of, if what we are trying to do is not leave out anybody from the story, sometimes that means that you need to have something like an estimate, or you need to work harder in a certain area, but it's not good enough to just go look where it's easy. And in terms of what's impactful and what's accurate, that means we take a very scientific view, but a very different practice than a lot of scientists do. When the answer is you're not totally certain, what do you do? I would say a lot of oil companies and a couple of scientists want us to just publish nothing. And our perspective is that doesn't help anybody. So publish saying, hey, we are not certain. There are big error bars here. The best data anybody can find is X, and we need to do more validation, but we're going to go publish what we have and ask for help doing more. That's the kind of thing you do when you're working backwards from what's impactful and what problem you're trying to solve, instead of starting with what data do I have and, like, worrying about, am I going to get criticized if I say something that might be wrong? And so the way we think about validation and impact is to kind of work backwards from, how do we not forget anybody and what problem does it need to solve for impact? And I've discovered that's a much different perspective on emissions data than a lot of the well-meaning community has. And it takes you in very interesting different directions in terms of what information you actually gather. The biggest example is that we have gone to the ends of the earth to have at least some estimate for every single facility in the world that is causing climate change. And that is radically different than most emissions data sets that 70, 80% of the earth that says, I'm not totally sure, so we'll say nothing.
I think that it's really, how do I put this? There are so many disparities, right, in data that, you're just, right? Yeah, like, this is what you're making me, this is what you're making me think about. And ever since, going back to my own uni days, right? Once I had the opportunity to sit in a room, and whether it was statistics, whether it was colonial history, whether it was whatever it was, there were so many examples of just all the missing people, all of the missing people, all of the missing environments, homes, situations. And the thing is that all of this data is necessary if we're truly, if we're truly going to be committed to creating a more equitable future, a more sustainable future, and ultimately a kinder future, certainly for future generations, and for us here right now, even us just having these conversations at this very moment, it's part of a commitment to this kinder future that I know we all want to live in. Now that you've given us significant insight, both of you, into, just how this data is collected and shared and protected and safeguarded and respected, how is it that journalists, on the subject of journalists and media professionals, how can they effectively use, climate traces emissions data, or youth mappers, geospatial tools, to investigate and report on climate impacts and accountability? Because that's where the meat of it is, for us journalists. We want to know because we know that you want to open up the New Yorker and read a 20,000 word, investigation that vindicates you. So, yeah. Could you let us know? Patricia, would you like to go first? Yeah.
We have a blog that is written by our students, youthmappers.org/blog. Hear from them.
Oh, okay. All right. We will have to do that. We will have to do that. Yeah.
And the data itself is always, the data they create is on OpenStreetMap, openstreetmap.org. That's where they publish their data.
OpenStreetMap.org.
Yeah.
All right. For
Great.
anybody who's listening, OpenStreetMap.org. All right.
I think our answer is a little different. OpenStreetMap is great, and we do have a blog. But in our case, I would say the primary use case for journalists is if you are thinking about stories that involve emissions, Climate Trace is the site you can go to where you'll source information from the most groups at once. So a lot of people are speculating, hey, is 2025 going to be the year that emissions start going down for the first time since the Industrial Revolution? 50-50 odds right now. And Climate Trace will have those data before anyone else. A lot of stories out there about is China's economy peaking, or is it going to keep going strong as they are getting so good at building clean energy? ClimateTrace.org is going to be the first place that'll have data on that. A lot of people are wondering, hey, my state is considering an environmental policy. What are the facts on where we are right now? Or my country committed to an environmental policy, did it work? Or I am looking at this company, what's their track record if they're making claims? So I would say when journalists are writing stories about emissions data, it's less that Climate Trace would have the stories, but all that data is right there so you can answer the questions and just arrive with more facts.
I would also love to know, we are about to close this out shortly, but I suppose the question that comes to mind for me right now, for both of you, is we live in a very complicated world, to say the least, on the subject of climate change. So what is it that keeps both of you going when you get up in the morning? Because there's a lot to do every single day, and you are both, committed to getting us the data, the info that we need in order to make actionable, take cohesive action and create the solutions for a better world. But you still need to get up every day. So what is it that keeps you going?
I mean, it's not done. We're not done yet. And they inspire me, the young people that I work with. And, I guess we keep saying that they're the leaders of the future, but they're really the leaders today. They're leading me. And I asked them, what is it that I need to do? And they've already told me, and they told me that I need to be a good ancestor. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Gavin?
I love that. I would say every year for about 25 years, I've been looking at two things. I look at what is the latest science on how bad climate change is going to be if we do nothing? And every year the answer is, oh, turns out it's even worse than we thought. And how much progress did we make this year towards reducing emissions? And every year, oh, turns out it's even better than what most scientists consider the best case scenario. If that happens 25 years in a row, we're doing it wrong. And so I have consistently been blown away by the news that emissions are going down faster than was considered possible again. And so I think that the trend lines of solar, electric vehicles, and other things are starting to grow faster and faster. There's good odds 2025, it could be 2026, is the year that actually those lines cross and the numbers start going down. And I think people are not prepared for what it's going to feel like when the climate fight suddenly is a winning fight. That's new and has never happened before, but we are so close now.
Thank you so much for that answer, Gavin. And I would just like to know, when is the new solution service coming online, that you mentioned?
Yeah, so in March 2025, which is in 2 weeks, we are moving towards releasing monthly data. And then in November for COP30, we are going to reveal one solution for every single thing in the world that's causing climate change.
Thank you so much for that. It's very good to know. And well, I would just like to thank you both for spending this very educational, very informative, and very fun hour with me. It's always a pleasure to learn more from, so many wonderful and esteemed experts. And I am, of course, very grateful to, and we here at the association are very grateful to, not just, of course, the wonderful work that you do with Youth Mappers, the wonderful work that you do with Climate Trace, and we are grateful to Arizona State University and the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory for all of their hard work and for their partnership. So thank you for your time and your commitment today. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you both. Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for having us.
Fantastic job, you guys. Thank you.